For 8 unrelenting years, every probing question regarding Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's marriage was swiftly shut down and branded as Islamophobia. Every investigative journalist who dared to ask was dismissed as a bigot, and every inquiry was aggressively labeled a partisan witch hunt. Throughout this nearly decade-long standoff, not a single piece of documentation was ever produced to settle the controversy once and for all. That absolute stonewall held until Senator John Kennedy placed a federal immigration form from 1,995 squarely on the table in front of her, a tangible, unyielding document bearing 2 specific names on the exact same line within the exact same family unit. It was a piece of paper she had spent her entire political career assuring the American public simply did not exist. As Kennedy read both names out loud for the congressional record, the Congresswoman, who had never been at a loss for words, found herself entirely unable to speak publicly. Before the verbal sparring even commenced, Omar had positioned herself with her back rigidly straight, her chin perfectly level, and her hands resting on the table at equal distances from her microphone. It was the precise physical geometry of a public figure who had been photographed from this exact angle enough times to understand that absolute symmetry reads to the public as composure, and composure is inevitably interpreted as innocence, a highly useful projection when a hostile line of questioning is imminent. Her hijab was adjusted with a meticulous precision that left absolutely no fold or crease to chance. When she initially spoke, her voice did not betray a single waver. Each word was delivered on the exact same frequency and at the precise same volume, echoing the rhythmic consistency of a machine producing identical parts. This hearing is not about oversight, she declared, actively choosing not to look at Senator Kennedy, but instead locking her eyes directly onto the camera, positioned to the left of the dais, the lens that carried the live feed to her intended audience. It is about a Muslim woman, a black woman, a refugee who came to this country with nothing and built a life that terrifies the people sitting across from her. She asserted that her political opponents, unable to defeat her legislative ideas, perpetually resorted to attacking her identity, her marriage, her family, and her faith. She accused them of relying on the exact same playbook for 8 long years. And I am here today because I have never been afraid of their questions, she proclaimed, testifying before the Senate hearing that she had exhaustively answered every single question posed to her over the past 8 years. Across the room, Senator Kennedy sat in stark contrast, his hands neatly folded, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose, and his legislative folder completely closed. Inside that unassuming folder rested the very document she had spent those 8 years insisting did not exist. During her defiant opening statement, Kennedy had not moved a singular muscle, not his hands, not his broad shoulders, not even his mouth. He possessed the eerie, deeply rooted stillness of a wooden fence post in a howling wind, upright, entirely unhurried, and resolute enough to simply wait until the severe weather inevitably passed. When she finally finished her defense, he allowed the cavernous room to hold the echo of her words for 5 agonizing seconds. In his native Louisiana, you afford a person the basic courtesy of finishing their entire thought before you begin yours, and in a high-stakes hearing room, that brand of calculated patience is the one weapon that outlasts all others. Congresswoman, he finally spoke, his voice dipping so far below hers in volume that the highly sensitive microphone had to seemingly lean into its work just to capture the sound. You said you've answered every question for 8 years, and I take you at your word. So I'm just going to ask a few of them one more time, real quick, and you can give me the same answers you've always given, and we'll all go home for supper. With methodical slowness, he opened the folder. He began by verifying that in 2009, she legally married a man named Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi, to which she answered yes. He then tracked back establishing that 7 years prior, in 2002, she had partaken in a faith ceremony with a man named Ahmed Hirsi, which she also confirmed. Kennedy then tightened the logical snare. You were in that faith marriage to Hirsi when you legally married Elmi. Omar's chin rose by a mere fraction of an inch as she retorted that they had separated, asserting that marriages end, people move on, and the situation was not complicated. Her words spilled out fast, not with the erratic pace of nervous energy, but with the rehearsed speed of a pre-assembled sentence rapidly deployed from a mental shelf. Kennedy countered with devastating politeness, noting that the situation was indeed complicated because in 2014 and 2015, while still legally married to Elmi, she had filed joint federal tax returns with Hirsi, a man she was not legally married to at the time. Omar immediately leaned toward her microphone with the urgent, forward-tilting posture of someone reaching for a handrail on a collapsing staircase, desperately wanting to insert her answer before the damning question could fully settle in the room. She claimed she corrected those specific tax filings voluntarily, that the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board had reviewed the matter, and that she had cooperated fully. The word voluntarily slipped out a half beat too fast, betraying the anxiety of someone who had practiced the response for this exact moment but did not trust the moment to wait for her. Kennedy swiftly clarified that she had corrected them only after the authorities discovered the error and brought it to her direct attention, prompting her to repeat that she had cooperated fully. Uttering the phrase twice in 2 consecutive sentences carried the anxious quality of a person checking a deadbolt twice. The redundant checking doesn't fortify the lock, but it reveals the profound insecurity of the person turning the key. Her hand instinctively drifted to the edge of the heavy wooden table, not forcefully gripping it, but seeking its solid reality the way someone navigates a dark room when the lights begin to ominously flicker. She pivoted to defense, arguing that immigration and faith-based marriages inherently create massive complexities that the rigid American tax system was never originally designed to accommodate. I would think a man who claims to support immigrant communities would understand that. She fired back, aiming the sentence at Kennedy like a sharp, certain finger pointed at the completely wrong suspect in a police lineup. Kennedy absorbed the blow without a flinch, a redirect, or a counterpunch. He simply nodded once, conceding that tax law is indeed complicated, before deliberately turning the page of his notes. His deeply unhurried movement was the true response. He pressed forward, asking about Ahmed Noor Said Elmi, her legal husband from 2009. She stated he was her ex-husband and that they had officially divorced in 2017. Kennedy then dropped the inquiry that had haunted her career. Is he your brother? The shift in the Congresswoman's facial expression was microscopic, but telling. It was a severe tightening of 2 specific muscles along the jaw, the masseter aggressively pulling the mandible a single millimeter upward. It was the exact type of involuntary defensive movement a high-definition camera catches forever, but a sterile written transcript completely misses, a physical reaction that occurs fractions of a second before the brain decides what words to deploy. That is a disgusting lie. She snapped, her voice spiking upward in pitch by a noticeable half-step, mimicking the distinct, high-tension sound of a steel cable tightening under sudden, immense weight. She vehemently blamed the allegations on bigoted blogs and Islamophobic conspiracy theorists who had supposedly targeted her since her very first day in office, insisting she had addressed the matter publicly and under oath, refusing to dignify it further. Kennedy, completely unmoved by the fiery indignation, responded with his baseline, low-level Louisiana drawl, reminding her that he had not asked about any blogs. He had asked a straightforward yes or no question. When she claimed to have repeatedly answered it for 8 years, he calmly noted that the answer was no, and pointed out that dismissing a valid question as a hate crime is fundamentally different from thoroughly answering it with a verifiable document. In a moment of sheer frustration, Omar's hand abandoned the safety of the table, performing an open palm gesture turned upward into the air. It was the universal, desperate gesture of a defendant appealing directly to the jury when the cold, hard evidence has definitively turned against them, the subtle plea of someone who has exhausted all physical exhibits and is now begging the room to simply feel what they can no longer empirically prove. She passionately argued she was not required to forcefully pry open her family's private records merely to satisfy the relentless curiosity of people whose sole mission was to destroy her, emphatically stating that no other member of the legislative body had ever been accused of marrying their own sibling. Congresswoman Kennedy interjected, sliding the word into the dead center of her emotional sentence with the cold, mechanical precision of a master key sliding into a complex lock. Omar's open palm immediately closed. Her fingers curled tightly inward, one by one, resembling a storefront aggressively pulling down its heavy steel shutters for the night. The hand returned to the table and lay completely dormant. She would not make another grand gesture for the remainder of the brutal exchange. Up in the viewing gallery, a woman who had been subtly, privately nodding along with Omar's identity-focused defense suddenly stopped cold. Her head froze at a peculiar angle, capturing the exact posture of a citizen rapidly recalculating a truth they had long considered entirely settled. Kennedy systematically pressed on, his low, level voice carrying the immense patience of a seasoned prosecutor who had been cross-examining witnesses longer than most people in the hearing room had been alive. He invoked the Star Tribune, specifically highlighting that it was her own hometown newspaper, not a conservative blog, not a right-wing talk show that had deeply investigated the marriage question. He noted that their own investigative journalists wrote in print that they could neither conclusively confirm nor rebut the severe allegation. He looked up over his glasses, reminding her that her own local paper tried desperately to clear her name but fundamentally failed because she flatly refused to provide them with the necessary documents. Omar's voice instantly scrambled to find a new footing, abandoning its razor-sharp opening frequency for something noticeably thinner and tighter. It was the strained sound of a heavy rope vibrating at the same tension after bearing an impossible load for far too long. She declared that journalists trafficking in Islamophobic conspiracy theories do not magically become credible simply because they are employed by a mainstream newspaper. When Kennedy bluntly asked if that meant the Star Tribune was Islamophobic, she quickly denied, saying that though her chin involuntarily dropped a fraction of an inch before instantly correcting itself. It was a microscopic physical flinch that her face desperately tried to mask the undeniable movement a person makes when they hear their own flawed logic played back to them in real time and realize a devastating second too late, exactly where that rhetorical trap leads. Kennedy, hands still serenely folded, deployed his folksy but lethal logic. He claimed to be just a country lawyer, but noted that in his courthouse, if you declare a specific question Islamophobic, and a journalist asks that exact question, the inescapable logical conclusion is that the journalist is Islamophobic. When she accused him of maliciously twisting her words, the accusation arrived with the chaotic speed of a defensive punch thrown by a fighter who has already lost their footing. Kennedy simply replied that he was reading her own words back to her, and then pulled another damning page from his meticulously organized folder. He detailed how, in June 2012, shortly after the birth of her third child, an Instagram account explicitly identified as belonging to Ahmed Elmi posted a photograph of a man holding her newborn baby, reading from a sterile printout with flat, specific precision. Kennedy noted that the accompanying caption did not say "my daughter" or "my stepdaughter," nor did it use the child's given name. The caption explicitly read, "nieces." He placed the printout onto the wooden table, allowing the single, highly consequential word to hang, suspended in the tense air. Nieces, that's what your husband called your newborn daughter. Omar desperately attempted to deflect, arguing that social media captions are not legally binding documents and attempting a frantic physical grounding technique, pressing the fingers of one hand into the inside of her opposite forearm. She argued that different cultures utilize distinct terms of endearment that do not translate directly into English. Kennedy immediately rejected the premise, stating that nieces is not a cultural term of endearment in any known culture, but rather a rigid family relationship denoting a sibling's child. Omar accused him of lacking expertise in Somali culture, playing her cultural defense card with the false confidence of a desperate, drowning person fiercely reaching for a piece of drifting wood, not because the driftwood will actually save them, but because it is the absolute last thing floating on the surface. Kennedy nodded the knowing nod of a veteran litigator who had fully anticipated the weak objection and had already drafted the brutal overrule. But the word nieces is English, he countered. Your husband wrote it in English on an American social media platform in the English language. And in English, it has one meaning, and the meaning is brother. He immediately pivoted the cross-examination to her current husband, pulling a brand new section of documents from the folder and carefully squaring it directly in front of him. The deliberate squaring was the distinct gesture of a man who firmly believes that meticulous organization is half the legal argument. He brought up Tim Minette, prompting Omar's posture to undergo a total reorganization. Her shoulders defensively drew back an inch, and her chin forcibly returned to a level position, much like a homeowner aggressively straightening a crooked picture frame they secretly know is destined to fall again. Kennedy detailed how her political campaign had hired Minette's consulting firm, the E Street Group, in 2018, and subsequently paid the firm over $3 million in consulting fees between 2018 and 2020. Omar quickly defended the payments, heavily emphasizing the word legitimate to describe the firm's professional services, anticipating the impending suggestion that they were anything but. However, Kennedy pointed out that during those exact same months, while the massive campaign checks were being steadily written, she had initiated a deeply personal relationship with Mr. Minette. Omar attempted to establish a boundary, asserting her personal life was not the subject of the oversight hearing, unnecessarily adjusting a microphone that hadn't moved an inch, a physical tell of a panicked person desperately needing something solidly bolted to the table to hold on to. Kennedy effortlessly dismantled the boundary, noting that Dr. Beth Jordan Minette, Tim's wife, certainly believed it was the subject when she filed for divorce in August 2019. Under penalty of perjury, the wife stated in court filings that her husband confessed he was leaving her for the Congresswoman. Kennedy stressed that this was not mere political gossip, but a sworn legal statement in a legitimate court of law. While he agreed not to press the personal side, he firmly declared that the massive money trail was entirely public record and strictly his legislative business. Kennedy extracted 3 final devastating pages from his stack. He laid each solitary page onto the table with the grave solemnity of a host, placing fine china at a dinner set for an incredibly difficult conversation. One by one, he laid out the undeniable facts. Marriage number 1 to Ahmed Hirsi, a faith ceremony with absolutely no legal record, a deliberate setup allowing her to legally marry an entirely different man without ever officially divorcing the first. The financial benefit? Illegally filing joint federal tax returns with a man she was not legally married to, all while being legally married to someone else. That is not a complexity of immigrant marriage, Congresswoman, Kennedy stated flatly. That is tax fraud, and the state of Minnesota found it. He touched the second page. Marriage number 2 to Ahmed Elmi, a legal marriage to a man her own hometown newspaper could not definitively verify wasn't her biological brother. The massive financial benefit, immediate immigration status. Kennedy revealed that whether that specific status was obtained fraudulently was, as of that very morning, officially under federal review. He touched the third page, marriage number 3 to Tim Minette. A legal marriage to the owner of a firm her own campaign had aggressively enriched to the tune of $3 million. The lucrative payments had commenced while he was still legally married to another woman, seamlessly continued after Omar married him, and shockingly, never decreased. Kennedy summarized the brutal pattern. 3 marriages, Congresswoman, 3 different men, every single one with a financial transaction running through it like a wire through a wall. Omar's voice frantically climbed the auditory scale, projecting the terrifying instability of a person teetering on a ladder, leaning dangerously away from a solid wall. The higher her voice went, the less stable her underlying defense became, the vowels stretching painfully thinner with each strained syllable as she blasted Kennedy's summary as an outrageous characterization of real human relationships and emotions. Kennedy refused to match her escalating volume. His voice remained locked in its low-level groove. It was the practice voice of a seasoned attorney who has spent 4 decades enduring much louder voices in much smaller courtrooms, implicitly understanding that the quiet, unrelenting voice is the only one the jury remembers when the deliberation room door finally closes. He calmly pointed out that FEC filings are not mere characterizations, but cold, hard line items showing $3 million flowing directly from her campaign accounts to a company owned by her romantic partner. And line items do not have emotions. They have numbers, he concluded. Omar opened her mouth, her jaw muscles violently engaging, her shoulders instinctively squaring for a fierce counterattack, but the argument completely failed to materialize. Her mouth snapped shut, and her shoulders slumped backward. For a fleeting, devastating fraction of a second, the entire hearing room witnessed the terrified face of a combatant who had confidently reached for a trusted weapon, only to find the holster completely empty. Kennedy folded his hands and diagnosed the pattern. 3 marriages, 3 money trails. Where I come from, Congresswoman, we'd call that a business model. Then Kennedy reached deep beneath his folder and produced one final, singular page. For the very first time all morning, he held a document with both of his hands. The subtle shift in handling heavily registered with the captivated room, carrying the ominous weight of a surgeon, suddenly picking up a critical medical chart with 2 hands instead of casually with 1. He stated that for 8 years, she had relentlessly assured the country that absolutely no document existed connecting her and Ahmed Elmi as members of the exact same biological family. Her voice, completely stripped of its prior sharpness and upward climb, had gone totally flat. It was the hollow flatness of a performer who had furiously burned through their entire repertoire and finally arrived at the very last available, exhausted note. Kennedy formally announced that the committee had successfully obtained, via a federal record subpoena, a verified immigration application originally filed in 1995 with the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, Form 1-130, a petition for alien relative. It was filed directly on behalf of her specific family unit for the purpose of family reunification. Instantly, Omar's hands went completely flat against the wooden table, her fingers involuntarily spreading wide. It was a purely physiological reaction, the body's primal bracing mechanism, heavily preparing for an impending, massive impact before the conscious mind could fully process the incoming danger. Kennedy began reading the names aloud at the slow, deliberate speed of official legal dictation. Every single name was treated as a completely separate sound, each syllable granted its own massive, suffocating space in the silent room. The petitioner, the dependent, the family members. When he finally arrived at 2 specific names, he stopped completely. That agonizingly long stop was significantly louder than any single word he had uttered all morning. Ilhan Omar. He looked up, peering over the metallic rims of his reading glasses, and his eyes locked directly onto hers. For the very first time during the hearing, she could not physically look away, and Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, He placed the ancient paper onto the wooden table. The paper made a barely audible sound when it made contact with the wood, but it was the profound sound of a devastating truth finally arriving after being in transit for 30 long years. Kennedy delivered the killing blow. Same application, same petition, same household, same family unit, relationship to petitioner for both names on the same line, in the same box, siblings. In the press row, a pen slipped from a stunned reporter's hand and hit the floor. Nobody even attempted to pick it up. Suddenly, the ambient hum of the fluorescent lights above the dais, a frequency that had been constant all morning but entirely ignored, became deafeningly apparent. Kennedy pressed her, reminding her she had claimed for 8 years that this document did not exist. Her voice dropped to a lower, faster register, desperately questioning the authenticity of the form and heavily relying on the defense that she was only 12 years old when it was originally filed by her father. Kennedy coolly confirmed it was subpoenaed directly from a secure federal records warehouse and fully authenticated by the INS, pointing out the damning black ink proving she and Elmi were legally documented as brother and sister. Omar's subsequent sentences began flying wildly out of her mouth without proper endings, violently launching in entirely new directions, only to violently smash into the exact same impenetrable wall of evidence. It was like watching a panicked bird repeatedly slamming into the same pane of glass from slightly different angles, producing the exact same tragic sound and result. Her previously expansive hand gestures shrank, her fingers curling inward, retreating from the open air as if the very atmosphere of the room could no longer safely support her political weight. She attempted to weave a convoluted defense about the massive complexities of refugee resettlement, hinting that the family designations on the 30-year-old forms did not accurately reflect reality. She abruptly stopped mid-sentence. She was dangerously building toward a legal defense that would explain away the siblings designation, but the entire room watched in real time as she mentally hit the disastrous conclusion of her own argument. If she admitted the form said one thing, but reality was another, it meant either the federal form was an outright lie, or her 8 years of fierce public denial were a lie. Both treacherous doors opened into the exact same inescapable room of guilt. Kennedy's intensely quiet voice cut through the silence like a scalpel, asking if she was formally alleging that her own father had flatly lied on a federal immigration form under penalty of perjury, a severe federal crime. The room held entirely still. The horrific word crime sat suspended in the air, heavy and immovable as a massive stone resting at the dark bottom of a well. Omar's mouth slightly opened. She began to form the first microscopic millimeter of a sound. It could have been an excuse. It could have been the very word she had successfully weaponized 1,000 times before, the powerful word that started with I, ended with phobia, and had aggressively slammed shut every investigative door she had ever needed closed. And then, miraculously, her mouth shut. The accusation remained entirely inside her. It stayed trapped in her throat because the undeniable authenticated document was sitting right there on the table. Form 130, black ink, official government letterhead. Her given name and Elmi's given name resting on the exact same line, bound to the exact same family, within a legal form filled out by her very own father. With the terrifying clarity of a hardened politician who had survived 8 turbulent years by deploying the exact right word at the exact right time, she instantly knew that hurling the word Islamophobic at a physical piece of paper would utterly break the word itself. Denouncing the form as bigoted would not make the two heavily scrutinized names on the same line magically unappear. Federal forms are exceptionally patient entities. They can sit in forgotten filing cabinets for decades, totally indifferent to what anyone calls them, and they simply do not ever go away. Moving as though the air had turned into dense water, her left hand slowly rose from the table. 2 trembling fingers came to rest gently on her lower lip, not fully covering her mouth. not actively hiding it, but simply pressing against the skin to forcefully hold back something terrible behind her teeth that desperately wanted out, but absolutely must not come out. Up in the gallery, the same supportive woman who had nodded fiercely during Omar's opening speech about her identity, who had sat noticeably straighter when Omar declared she terrified the powerful people in the room, was no longer looking at the Congresswoman. The devoted supporter was staring strictly at the document. She was staring at the I-130, at the two identical names locked on the exact same line. She was visually analyzing the paper with the deeply critical gaze of someone looking at hard evidence rather than blindly admiring the person the evidence belonged to. That brutal shift in gaze from the politician to the paperwork was a devastating public verdict that required absolutely no committee chairman to formally announce, "I have nothing further to say at this time." 9 cold words. It was the most frigid, mechanical sentence she had ever spoken on public record. There were no dramatic accusations of disgusting lies. There were no fiery claims of bigoted attacks. It was strictly a lawyer's sterile sentence, the emergency ripcord phrase legal counsel drills into a client to deploy when the entire defense catastrophically falls apart. It was the horrifying sound of an elected politician instantly transforming into a criminal defendant on live national television broadcast in front of a fractured country that had been aggressively asking the exact same question for 8 years and had, for the very first time, received a chilling answer that wasn't a deflection, an accusation, or a word ending in phobia, but a government form with 2 names on the exact same line. Kennedy stood up from his chair. He slowly walked the entire length of the grand table with the purposeful stride of an old man walking a property line he had known intimately his entire life, mentally counting the boundary fence posts with his fingers. Each invisible post represented a boundary. Each boundary was a cold, hard fact. 2002, a faith marriage to Ahmed Hirsi. No legal record, he recounted, touching an imaginary post. Lancelingjo, a legal marriage to Ahmed Elmi, while still in a faith marriage to the first man. Touch, 2014, 2015. Joint federal tax returns filed with the first man while legally married to the second. Touch, 2017. Divorce from Elmi, 8 years after the wedding. 2 years after the tax fraud was found. Touch, 2018. Legal marriage to Hirsi. Finally, touch, 2019. Divorce from Hirsi because there was a third man now. Touch, 2020. Marriage to Tim Minette. $3 million in campaign funds already paid to his company. Touch. He finally arrived at the last devastating page, the I-130. He rested his finger on the aged paper, significantly longer than the others. It was long enough for every zooming camera lens to perfectly capture the gesture. Long enough for a stunned man in the gallery to lean precariously forward to see exactly what was printed on the page. 1,995. A federal immigration form. Your name, Elmi's name, same line, same family, siblings. He turned back and stared down the Kanglaun across the expansive table, a stark white line of heavily documented evidence lying between them. 8 individual pages, 8 specific dates, 8 highly questionable transactions. It was an undeniable paper trail stretching from his side of the table directly to hers, resembling a long, paved road leading to a dark place neither of them could ever pretend didn't exist anymore. He summarized the absolute devastation. Not a single one of her 3 heavily scrutinized relationships existed without a massive, tangled financial transaction attached to it, ranging from fraudulent immigration benefits and complex tax fraud to a staggering $3 million in campaign cash flowing directly into the pockets of the man she was sleeping with. Kennedy slowly removed his glasses. deliberately folding them with the profound care of an intellectual closing, a heavy book he has definitively finished reading. He set the glasses on the table right beside the I-130. The sharp, metallic click of the hinges loudly carried through the deafening quiet of the room, mirroring the absolute finality of a heavy iron latch engaging as a door violently closes for the last time. You called it Islamophobia, Mrs. Omar. For 8 years, every question was Islamophobia. Every journalist who asked was a bigot. Every investigation was a witch hunt. He touched the historic piece of paper one final, lingering time, noting that for 8 long years, it had just been sitting quietly in a metal drawer, gathering dust in the dark of a government warehouse, completely unpulled. He sat back down, folded his hands, and delivered a devastating final thought that was quieter than everything that had preceded it, yet infinitely louder. Somebody asked. The resulting digital explosion was instantaneous and massive. The explosive video clip smashed into 55 million views in a staggering 72 hours. The public dubbed it the documents. The short, viral 40-second cut featuring Kennedy methodically reading the I-130 data, proving they were siblings, followed immediately by Omar's trembling fingers pressing desperately against her lower lip and delivering her 9-word capitulation, circulated fundamentally differently than ordinary political clips. The deafening silence contained within that brief clip was not the ordinary silence of a politician who had simply lost a difficult policy argument. It was the chilling, terrifying silence of a fugitive who had definitively been found. The immense fallout was rapid. The Department of Justice formally announced a sweeping review of the ancient immigration application, heavily coordinating directly with the Department of Homeland Security. Simultaneously, the House Ethics Committee officially ripped open a massive formal investigation probing deeply into Omar's chaotic tax filings and the highly suspect $3 million in campaign disbursements funneled to the E Street Group. Representative Nancy Mace, who had previously attempted to aggressively subpoena Omar's financial records in January only to be totally blocked, succinctly posted a devastating one-sentence reaction online. Somebody pulled the drawer open. Within a mere 48 hours, 3 different Democratic members of the Minnesota delegation had carefully released highly calculated public statements. Notably, none of them dared mention Omar by name, but every single one heavily utilized the ominous word accountability. As the shockwaves of the brutal Senate hearing rippled across the nation, the stark contrast between those who respected the system and those who allegedly exploited it became painfully clear in a quiet Virginia apartment where Amir, a legal immigrant who sacrificed 7 grueling years to honestly navigate the unforgiving labyrinth of American bureaucracy, watched the broadcast not with fiery anger, but with the bone-deep existential exhaustion of a man realizing an elite politician bypassed the rules while ruthlessly branding her skeptics as bigots. 1,000 miles away in the humid quiet of a Louisiana night, Senator John Kennedy sat completely unbothered on his back porch, marveling over a glass of warm iced tea at the sheer audacity of a political survival strategy built entirely on volume. The damning 1,995 immigration form hadn't even been meticulously hidden, but merely left gathering dust in a forgotten metal drawer for 8 long years, simply because the Congresswoman yelled fiercely enough to keep the press and investigators away. Yet, inside a heavily secured Washington apartment, the yelling had finally stopped, violently replaced by the terrifying, deafening scratch of a defense attorney's pen across a yellow legal pad as Ilhan Omar sat frozen in the suffocating silence of a crumbling empire. For a refugee who had escaped a chaotic world of burning paper and vanishing records, the chilling realization of the true American cold had finally set in a rigid, highly documented nation where the past never turns to dust, but waits patiently in dark government warehouses under sterile fluorescent lights until someone inevitably pulls the drawer open. Now, trapped at her own kitchen table by a single piece of fragile paper she firmly believed had vanished with her old life, the ultimate question hangs heavily over Washington. Has the undeniable revelation of this long-buried document irrevocably shattered the impenetrable political firewall she spent nearly a decade building, or is this merely the terrifying opening tremor of an unprecedented congressional collapse?